What did Ralph Waldo Emerson mean by the oversoul?
Emerson's idea of the soul came to him from reading the Bhagavad Gita and commentaries on it. Nonetheless, his ideas bear a striking similarity to European Neoplatonic thought. Emerson wrote, "The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere. That unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. That common heart, of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission, that overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents, and constrains every one to pass for what he is, and to speak from his character, and not from his tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand, and become wisdom, and virtue, and power, and beauty. We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the Eternal One.
When did philosophy begin?
In the West, the scientific aspect of philosophy, or abstract general thought about the natural and human worlds, began in ancient Greece in the 7th century B.C., with inquiry about the earth and the cosmos by the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, many of whom continued to flourish in Socrates' time. Between the pre-Socratics and Socrates, the sophists were the first to focus on the human world. Although their methods were adversarial and perhaps unethical, they were paid for their arguments. Without concern about their truth or the justice of what they were arguing for. With Socrates' activities in the 5th century BCE, and his student Plato's dramatization of Socrates' style of discourse in written dialogues in the 4th century BCE, the true humanistic side of philosophy was founded. The two big subjects of the natural world and the human world endured as the concerns of philosophers. Well after the physical and social sciences branched out on their own. These subjects are also perennial in ordinary life.
Aquinas really have a recipe for making mice?
Like many of his contemporaries, Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, believed in the spontaneous generation of insects and vermin. The doctrine of spontaneous generation held that life could literally just appear, without the prior presence of parent organisms. This biological mythology went back to Aristotle and is in fact strangely empirical, if you think about it. Flies, for example, do suddenly seem to appear out of rotting garbage. It took a long time well into the 17th century to discover That the maggots they spring from come from eggs laid by parent flies. Aquinas thought that insects sprang to life in filth, owing to the devil's influence. He thought that the development of mice, however, depended on changes in the positions of the stars. As proof of this origin of baby mice, Aquinas had a recipe. Take some old rags and wheat and leave them undisturbed in a drawer for a while. To give the stars enough time to exert their effects, and then take a peek. Again, there is a crude empiricism at work here. If there are mice in a dwelling, its inhabitants rarely see them breed. And rarer still do they observe female mice building nests and giving birth. If this has happened in a neglected drawer, all that may be evident when one suddenly opens it is the litter of pink babies when the last time one looked there was nothing but old rags and wheat. If you try this at home, the wheat is probably unnecessary. Although the mother mouse will doubtless appreciate it.
Who was Arthur Schopenhauer?
Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788 to 1860, was influenced by the other German idealists, whom he despised as optimistic fools. Unlike Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831, and both the right or the left Hegelians, his view of the idea that formed and worked the world was pessimistic.
Who is Angela Davis?
Angela Davis, 1944, is a world-famous African-American social critic and political activist. In 1970, she was acting assistant professor in the philosophy department at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a member of the Communist Party USA. She was also once associated with the Black Panther Party. Davis was criminally indicted for helping Black Panther member George Jackson to escape from a courtroom in Marin County, California, in 1970. The guns Jackson used were registered in Angela Davis' name. She was for a while on the FBI's most wanted list after she fled arrest. In the end, Davis was acquitted of criminal charges and was rehired at the university. Davis claimed that she never completed her dissertation because it was lost in papers confiscated by the FBI. She has since developed a distinguished career in critical writings about race and gender as well as the prison industrial complex in contemporary American culture. Davis' principal works include If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance, 1971. Frame Up, The Opening Defense Statement Made, 1972, Angela Davis, An Autobiography. 1974, Women, Race and Class, 1981, Violence Against Women and the Ongoing Challenge to Racism. 1985, Women, Culture and Politics, 1989, Blues Legacies and Black Feminism. Gertrude Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday, 1999, Are prisons obsolete? 2003, An Abolition Democracy, Beyond Prisons, Torture, and Empire, 2005.
How is Confucianism relevant to contemporary Western philosophy?
Confucianism is conservative and does not appear to be based on individual autonomy or self-rule. Its highest moral principle seems to be social conformity. To this extent it is not easily imported into Western moral, political, and social philosophy. However, a number of contemporary moral philosophers have found some appeal in the Confucian egalitarian ideal of respect for all beings. Confucianism has also been received as an alternative virtue ethics theory, as well as for its utilitarian/consequentialist notion that correct behavior will maximize happiness. Such comparative ideas, as well as contemporary interpretations and applications of Confucianism, can be found in the following sources: Bo Mao, Comparative Approaches to Chinese Philosophy, 2003. Lishang Lisa Rosenli, Confucianism and Women, A Philosophical Interpretation, 2006, Philip J. Ivanhoe, Ethics in the Confucian Tradition, The Thought of Menzi and Wang Yangming, 2002, Brian W. Van Norden, Confucius and the Analects, New Essays, 2002, and Kwang-Loi Shun and David B. Wang, Confucian Ethics, A Comparative Study of Self, Autonomy and Community, 2004.
What do critics of the deep ecological and animal value views claim?
William F. Baxter, a law professor who passed away in 1998, argued in People or Penguins: The Case for Maximum Pollution, 1974, that the cost of a pollution-free society would be harmful to humans. He assumed that humanism requires that humans are what matter above all else. Baxter expressed a general critical view of environmentalism held by human beings who do not believe that animals have intrinsic worth or rights equal to those of humans.
Teresa, and what were her main ideas?
St. Teresa of Avila, 1515–1582, entered the Carmelite order when she was 22. And there she sought guidance in how to pray until she was 47. In 1560 she became part of the reform movement among the Spanish Carmelites. Her main works were the Vita, Life, which was her spiritual autobiography, and Way of Perfection, and the Interior Castle. Her main project was to help readers surrender to the Divine Trinity. Teresa held that mysticism developed in stages. In her life, she says that the soul is like a garden. First, weeds need to be removed and then water must be carried from a well. The senses must be subdued to minimize distraction during this initial labor of prayer and meditation. The prayer of quiet in the second stage is like irrigation with the help of a water wheel. And in the third stage a condition of contemplation is achieved, which is analogous to having a running brook through one's garden. By this time, the senses no longer function normally and the soul wants to withdraw from the world and unite with God. In the fourth stage, this union is achieved. In the interior castle. Teresa uses the analogy of a castle with many rooms to describe a life of contemplation. After 6 early stages, the soul comes into the direct presence of God. In what way was St.
Who was Albertus Magnus?
Albertus Magnus, 1200 to 1280. Was a German Dominican theologian who was also a dedicated scholar of philosophy. As Master of Theology at the University of Paris, he was a member of the commission that condemned the Jewish holy book, the Talmud. His philosophical contributions consisted mainly of Aristotelian commentaries. And where Aristotle disagreed with Catholic doctrine, Magnus corrected him and substituted different accounts. He relied on astrology in his view of the physical world, believing, for instance, that when the influence of Jupiter and Saturn increased the result was great fire. Whereas when this influence decreased, there would be floods.
Who was Tenskwatawa?
The prophet, Tenskwatawa, also known as Tenskwatawa, or by his original name, Lalaithika, 1775 to 1834, was the brother of the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. Tenskwatawa was a powerful orator who preached a return to Native American traditions as a form of resistance against destruction and oppression suffered. In a speech to Governor William Henry Harrison in 1810, he expressed what was later to become a broadly American form of self-creation. Combined with biting wit, it is true I am a Shawnee. My forefathers were warriors. Their son is a warrior. From them I take only my existence, from my tribe I take nothing. I am the maker of my own fortune, and oh, that I could make of my own fortune, and oh, that I could make that of my red people, and of my country. As great as the conceptions of my mind, when I think of the spirit that rules the universe. I would not then come to Governor Harrison to ask him to tear the treaty and to obliterate the landmark. But I would say to him, Sir, you have liberty to return to your own country.
What was philosophical about the thought of Desiderius Erasmus?
Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 to 1536, was born in Holland as the illegitimate Son of a priest. He became widely known and highly respected throughout England and Europe for his biblical translations and ideas about religion. He was one of the first thinkers after antiquity to admit to skepticism in religious debates. His Moride Encomium, in praise of folly, reintroduced the idea of a simple, pious Christianity. However, when Martin Luther, 1483–1546, tried to enlist his support in the Protestant Reformation, he resisted taking his side. When Luther criticized him for this, Erasmus responded with On Free Will, in which he argued that it was impossible to know. As Luther claimed to know, that man did not have free will. Erasmus was not himself a philosopher, but he made fun of the preoccupations of the scholastics and inaugurated their subsequent reputation as intellectually trivial. Through his influence in Europe on its educational systems, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew became more widely taught. Overall, he was a great supporter of the kind of critical spirit that many scholars believe eventually produced the Enlightenment.
How do philosophers deal with ethical relativism?
Philosophers intensely dislike prescriptive ethical relativism. It makes the analysis of moral terms and the construction of moral systems pointless because there is no way to justify them. Different positions have been taken about descriptive moral relativism. Some philosophers deny it, claiming that once we understand moral systems that seem to be different from our own, we can derive universal moral principles from all moral systems that apply to all human beings. Others have argued that even though there are different viewpoints about what is morally right, some of those viewpoints are simply wrong, and then their job is to show how they are wrong.
How was Hume a man of contradictions?
Hume is famous for having written, "Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man." Hume described himself as a man of mild dispositions, of command of temper, of an open, social, and cheerful humor, capable of attachment, but little susceptible of enmity, and of great moderation in all my passions. During his last painful illness with cancer, when his friend Adam Smith, 1723–1790, visited him, he was calm and had no regrets about his atheism. Nor did he desire to make a religious conversion in case there was an afterlife. He did in fact have a lifelong reputation of being pleasant and highly reasonable. He was known as the Good David, in England, and Le Bon David in France. But, concerning his moderation, Hume very much enjoyed fine food and drink and weighed over 300 pounds. And as for his mildness, his friendship with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–1778, suggests otherwise. When Rousseau was given refuge in England, partly due to Hume's efforts, In 1766, Hume soon came to regret it. Although Le Bon Davide had enjoyed great fame in the salons of Paris, Rousseau was a world celebrity of greater wattage. Rousseau was also financially pressed and very sensitive to public opinion. He wore exotic costumes and was made fun of in state English society. Hume did nothing to temper this reaction. Rousseau soon became distrustful of Hume's friendship and accused him of perfidy. Instead of letting the matter rest, Hume published their correspondence. Going against the advice of his close friends, who were prepared to make allowances for Rousseau, because they knew how personally troubled he was. This publication, together with Hume's denial that he had himself leaked the letters, destroyed his friendship with Rousseau and incurred skepticism about his own goodwill, good sense, and underlying motives.
Who is Julia Kristeva?
Since arriving in France in 1966 from Bulgaria, Julia Kristeva, 1941, has achieved international recognition for her writings about women in the psychoanalytic tradition. Her work is considered multidisciplinary, encompassing art criticism, philosophy, and cultural critique. Kristeva's primary theoretical contribution has been a distinction between the symbolic aspects of language and what she calls the semiotic, a psychic level of meaning based on a child's relationship to its mother. Primary human desires are attached to the semiotic, which is based on the biological rhythms of the maternal body. Although the semiotic eludes symbolic translation,
What were the important ideas of the Sophists?
first and foremost, the Sophists were in revolt against the pre-Socratic idea that there is some ultimate reality that is unlike what we perceive and experience in the ordinary world, but in some sense causes what we do perceive and experience. The Sophists elevated the importance of the world that appeared to exist for human beings. Or as the 20th century philosopher Jürgen Habermas, b. 1929, famously called it, the life world, although Edmund Husserl 1859–1938 originated the term. They all thought that virtue can be taught, which meant that anyone could participate in government, regardless of their wealth or social class. In that sense, the Sophists enabled ancient Greek democracy. The Sophists insisted that moral beliefs should have rational reasons and be capable of defense in rational argument. In sophistic treatments of morality, human nature was often opposed to society or convention, and the Sophists were on the side of nature. Finally, it should be noted that the Sophists practiced in an oral tradition, which Socrates was to bring to a level of elegant perfection that no single philosopher or school has equaled in the millennia since his death.
Who was Mikhail Bakunin?
Mikhail Bakunin, 1814–1876, was a Russian anarchist and revolutionary who was active in Europe from 1840 to 1849 and 1861 to 1871. During the years between these periods, he was imprisoned in both Europe and Russia, and for a time was exiled to Siberia. His views are held to be contradictory because he believed both that the instinct for freedom in the masses would lead to revolution and that revolution would need to be the result of a plan by educated elite. In his first period, Bakunin criticized liberal projects to reconcile the demands of workers with the establishment. And he was particularly excoriating about both the church and the state. In his second period, he attacked scientism, or the dominance of technical approaches to public policy, calling for a revolt of life against science. Overall, Bakunin and his followers were opposed to the development of Marxism.
What is the distinction between deep and shallow ecology?
According to Arnnes, 1912, shallow ecology is concern of affluent Westerners for their own clean air and water, abundant resources, and beautiful scenery. Deep ecology, by contrast, is based on biospheric egalitarianism, or the inherent value to all natural beings of their own existence, shared equally by them all. Nice envisioned the world as a total field or biospherical net in which individual organisms are related to the whole of their environments. As individuals, human beings, for example, are mere knots in the net and ought to forego some of their preoccupation with their own individual existence and selfish interests.
From what did Vico believe the cycles of history originated?
Vico thought that God ordained the cycles of history in his divine providence, an idea that Vico held to be compatible with the fact that human beings might have other aims or goals than what actually does transpire. This idea is believed to have been influential in Friedrich Hegel's 1770 to 1831 notion of the cunning of reason. The general idea is that history always turns out to be something different from what people intended.
What is feminist philosophy of science?
Feminist philosophy of science consists of analyses of scientific methodology and standards for truth. Its focus has been on the ways that the idea of objectivity have excluded knowledge of importance to women.
Was Thomas More serious about his utopian vision?
Although Sir Thomas More, 1478 to 1535, later, St. More, was strongly influenced by Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 to 1536, mockery of scholasticism. His ideas in his most important work, Utopia, are quite sober and serious. The work itself became a model for modern descriptions of the ideal society. Like Erasmus, More returned to Greek philosophy and early Christianity for ideals of human life. More sought inspiration from Epicurus, 341 to 271 BCE, and, like his guide, extolled simple and natural pleasures among friends with the same tastes. The principal narrator of Utopia is Raphael Hythlodaeus, a well-traveled philosopher who is fond of Plato, Plutarch, and Aristotle, as well as the Roman intellectuals Seneca and Cicero. The island of Utopia is a completely egalitarian, communistic society. Reflecting More's values, Utopia favors rights for women, traditional families, and a reliance on Christian virtues to support its main purpose of achieving happiness for all in their earthly lives.
What is eliminative materialism?
Eliminative materialism is the doctrine, first proposed by Paul Feyerabend, 1974 to 1994, in the early 1960s, that science will eventually make it possible to eliminate all customary talk that presupposes non-material minds in favor of references to brain states only. The Canadian-born American philosopher Paul Chitchland, 1942, and his wife, Patricia Chitchland, 1943, have developed this view into a distinct branch of philosophy of mind. The Chitchlands have held that our ordinary common sense theory of mind consisting of intentions, desires, and motives is mere folk psychology, which, like other folk beliefs, ought to be put aside in intellectual and scientific endeavors. Chitchland wrote, "Eliminative materialism is the thesis that our common sense conception of psychological phenomena constitutes a radically false theory. A theory so fundamentally defective that both the principles and the ontology of that theory will eventually be displaced, rather than smoothly reduced, by completed neuroscience." Principal publications by Paul Chitchland include Scientific Realism and the Plasticity of Mind, 1979. Eliminative Materialism and the Propositional Attitudes, published in the Journal of Philosophy in 1981. And the Engine of Reason, The Seat of the Soul, 1996, both Paul and Patricia penned on the contrary, 1998.
How did medicine progress after Hippocrates?
Galen of Pergamum, c. 129 c. 216 CE, preserved Hippocratic medicine, which continued largely unchanged through the Renaissance. Galen was able to increase knowledge of physiology by dissecting pigs and apes. Since human dissection was against Roman law, He learned how to treat trauma and wounds while working as a physician in a gladiator school. Galen performed many operations, including brain and eye surgery. The removal of cataracts, which were not attempted again for almost 2,000 years. He eventually became a physician to Marcus Aurelius, 121 to 180 CE. In the 9th century, Galen's writings were translated into Arabic by Hunan ibn Ishaq, 809 to 873. However, the Arabs rarely practiced surgery, and among Christians, the knowledge and practice of surgery had already been abolished. Galen remains so highly regarded that when dissections during the Renaissance appeared to contradict his descriptions, they were considered anomalous. His prescription of bloodletting for almost every illness was followed as late as the 19th century.
Who was Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach?
Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach, 1804 to 1872, criticized German idealism as a form of theology, or a rationalization of religion. His project was to invert Friedrich Hegel's, 1770 to 1831, relationship between the individual and the absolute. Whereas for Hegel, the individual was an effect or expression of the absolute. For Feuerbach, the absolute was an effect or expression of the individual. Feuerbach's main works were, Toward a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy, 1839, The Essence of Christianity. 1841, Principles of the Philosophy of the Future, 1843, and The Essence of Religion, 1846. He collaborated with Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and was active in the late 1840s revolutionary period, but then retired from public life and died poor.
What was Richard Rorty's concept of philosophy?
Rorty, 1931 to 2007, viewed philosophy as an ongoing free conversation or exchange of ideas that might be pursued passionately but nonetheless could not arrive at a kind of truth that did not exist. Philosophy was an opportunity to creatively reinvent oneself. Although he continually expressed liberal views, he did not think a rational view of universal human rights was possible to construct, but that empathy and related sentiments could be cultivated by reading literature and through the right early education.
Who was Jacques Lacan?
Jacques Lacan, 1901 to 1981, was a psychoanalyst who was barred from the International Psychoanalytic Association for his ideas, which nonetheless were very influential. His main works are Écrits, Writings, 1966, The Language of the Self, 1978, and his published seminars. Lacan applied a Saussurean notion of the linguistic order to Freudian psychology. He thought that metaphor and metonymy, substitution of an attribute of a thing for a thing itself, were the main unconscious mechanisms, and that psychotherapy literally works as a form of speech that corrects speech by reinserting into discourse what has been obscured from it by neurosis. Lacan is famous for his claim that the ego consists merely of identifications made imaginatively. He meant that human beings imagine themselves as having certain characteristics at an early age, and that is how the self develops. Speech creates social connection. But language is a formal system in which words derive meanings from other words only.
Who was the Marquis de Sade?
Dinatien Alphonse François de Sade, 1740–1814, was a French nobleman and revolutionary best known for his shocking pornographic works Justine, The Misfortunes of Virtue, Juliet, Vice Richly Rewarded, 120 Days of Sodom, The School of Licentiousness, Incest, and the Crimes of Love. In an age that was not strongly focused on vice and sin, he managed to spend over 30 years of his life incarcerated in an insane asylum, as well as in prison, mostly on account of his writing. The term sadism is based on his name.
Who were Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno?
Max Horkheimer, 1893–1973, and Theodor Adorno, 1903–1969. were founding members of the Frankfurt School, and they were its leaders in exile. Horkheimer was a cultural critic and social philosopher. Adorno was a cultural critic and musicologist. Horkheimer's ideal was a general understanding of the place of human beings in society. He thought, contrary to orthodox Marxists who often viewed society from the standpoint of the proletariat, that no social class at that time escaped distortions in its social worldview. Adorno thought that Austrian composer Arnold Schoenberg's atonal music supported human autonomy or freedom, and he strongly condemned jazz as a form of music for the masses, in contrast. In a way, given their shared view that Marxism should not be culturally centered on the proletariat, it is not surprising that Horkheimer and Adorno collaborated, producing Dialectic of Enlightenment, 1974. They argued that the progress sought in the Enlightenment could not be achieved, and that instead the result would be either mass capitalistic vulgarity in a consumer economy, or totalitarian brutality.
What were the ideas of the main religious existentialists?
Martin Buber, 1878–1965, connected existentialism to Judaism by emphasizing that whereas Christians have direct individual relationships to God, the Jewish relationship to God is mediated by membership in a community. as a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. After he left Vienna in 1938, Buber tried to reconcile Jews and Arabs. Buber criticized the subject-object form of knowledge as a mode in both human and religious relationships. In its place, he advocated an I-thou relationship that recognized the subjectivity of the other. His main work is I and Thou, 1923. Karl Jaspers, 1883–1969, thought that philosophy should help human beings with their projects of self-discovery toward a goal of existence, or authentic selfhood, based on an understanding of one's own life. Although not a traditional theologian, Jaspers nevertheless addressed individual spiritual yearnings. His main works are Philosophy, 1932, On the Origin and Goal of History, 1949, and Way to Wisdom, 1950. Gabriel Marcel, 1889–1973, was both a philosopher and a playwright who addressed human existence in terms of community and personal relationships. He emphasized we are, instead of I am, drawing on both Søren Kierkegaard, 1813–1855, and Buber. He also approached philosophy as a Bergsonian intuitionist by relying on his immediate insights for his views, rather than arriving at them through argument. His main works include Mystery of Being, 1951, and Man Against Mass Society, 1955. His William James Lectures at Harvard University, 1961, 1962, were published as The Existential Background of Human Dignity. Simone Weil, 1909–1943, was born into a Jewish Parisian family but converted first to leftist syndicalism, which was a Marxist political movement with the goal of putting labor unions in control of both industry and government. Her subsequent religious thought was a combination of Neoplatonism, Christianity, and Jewish mysticism. She was an activist on behalf of the democratically elected government during the Spanish Civil War, and for the French resistance during World War II. She criticized the way in which Marxism had become a religion to some and objected to the dehumanizing effects of capitalism. Her solution was meaningful work as a fundamental human need. Her main writings, published posthumously, are Gravity and Grace, 1947, and Oppression and Liberty, 1955.
How is Christian philosophy different from Christian theology?
The main job of medieval Christian theologians was to intellectually work out the doctrine of the Catholic Church, without questioning its basic premises or the content of the religion that was based on the New Testament. The main job of medieval Christian philosophers was to explain how accepted knowledge that did not have Christian origins was compatible with Christian theology. This distinction was not made in the early church writings, such as those of Saint Augustine. What was St.
What was the intellectual merit of de Saude's endeavors?
De Soto was elected to the National Convention in 1790 and wrote political pamphlets calling for a direct vote. Simone de Beauvoir, 1908 to 1986. And other 20th-century existentialists interpreted a radical doctrine of freedom in his writings. His emphasis on the importance of sexuality in human life is said to have anticipated Sigmund Freud. Others have seen seeds of nihilism in his work. The 20th-century psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan claimed that de Soto's ethics were a counterpart to Immanuel Kant's, 1724–1804, categorical imperative. The 20th-century feminist Andrea Dworkin, 1946–2005, analyzed de Soto to illustrate the inherently violent misogynistic nature of all heterosexual pornography.
Why was Averroes considered important by other philosophers?
Averroes, known as Ibn Rushd in the Islamic world, c. 1126 c. 1198, was born in Córdoba, Spain. He brought the tradition of comparative philosophy begun by Avicenna and rendered problematic by Al-Ghazali to a new level of intellectual sophistication. His main project was to settle the debate among his contemporaries about whether Aristotle's philosophy was compatible with Islam. As Avicenna had claimed, or opposed to it as Al-Ghazali, 1058–1111, had objected.
How did James Martineau make Immanuel Kant's metaphysics religious?
Martineau relied on intuition to claim that the phenomenal world mirrors a noumenal world. The world of things we cannot experience, in which real objects are causally related. He held that this reality is the result of God's will. In ethics he claimed that we choose our motives first and then our actions. Intuition tells us which ones are the higher motives and that the highest one is reverence. He meant that the desire to revere motivates our best actions.
What is process philosophy?
Process philosophy was an early 20th century system of thought that was strongly influenced by Albert Einstein's theory of relativity and other scientific ideas, such as the wave theory of light and subatomic physics. The fundamental metaphysical premise of process philosophy is that the basic unit of existence is not a stable thing, such as an atom, but events or change over time. The two most prominent process philosophers were Alfred North Whitehead, 1861–1947, and Charles Hartshorne, 1897–2000.
How was G. E. Moore a realist?
More was at times a naive realist and at other times a representative realist. All realists believe that there is a real, external world. Naive realists hold that we directly perceive objects in this world. Representative realists think that what we perceive are the effects of those objects on our organs of sense. Or, in other words, that what we perceive are not objects but sense data caused by real objects.
What was the Invisible College?
In 1645 Robert Boyle, 1627–1691, and other younger scientists met weekly over lunch to discuss current scientific news about research in England and Europe. They called themselves the Invisible College. They discussed the Copernican theory, William Harvey's evidence for the closed circulation of blood, barometric experiments with mercury, and studies of magnetism. After England's King Charles I was beheaded, this group, and their friends, who had academic posts at Oxford, organized the Philosophical Society of Oxford. Following a lecture on astronomy at Gresham College by Christopher Wren, 1632–1723, in 1660. Plans were made to found a college for providing physio-mathematical learning. Charles II approved their plans within a week. There were 115 original members. 1/3 were scientists, and the first president was Lord Brunecker, the leading mathematician of the day. This was the Royal Society of London for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge. It was presented with a silver mace by King Charles II at its inaugural meeting on July 15, 1662. It exists to this day as an independent academy for scientific knowledge in the United Kingdom.
How did William Harvey discover the closed circulatory system?
William Harvey, c. 1578 or 1579–1657, was educated at Cambridge and studied at Padua, where Copernicus, 1473–1543, had also studied. His father-in-law was a prominent London physician, and Harvey became a doctor at St. Bartholomew's Hospital and a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. Ibn al-Nafi, 1213–1288, and Michael Servetus, 1511–1553, had described pulmonary circulation earlier. But Servetus' work was lost by the time Harvey had begun his research. Hieronymus Fabricius, who taught Harvey at the University of Padua, had discovered valves in veins, but Harvey was not satisfied with his explanation, and sought a more encompassing theory of how blood moved in the body. In his 1628 Exercitation Anatomica de motus cordis et sanguinis in animalibus, an anatomical exercise on the motion of the heart and blood in animals, Harvey claimed that the heart pumped blood throughout the body in a closed system, Galen had believed that venous blood came from the liver and arterial blood from the heart, each of which sent blood to the different parts of the body where it was consumed. Harvey recorded his observations during vivisections, dissections of live animals, quantifying the amount of blood that passed through the heart and counting the beats of the heart. He estimated the amount of blood pumped in a day, depending on the size of the heart. He postulated two circulatory loops, one to the lungs and the other to the vital organs, and he correctly described the role of the valves of the veins in returning blood to the heart. Harvey was personal physician to both James I and Charles I. That gave him the opportunity to vivisect deer from the royal parks for his experiments and demonstrations. He was also able to observe a pumping human heart in the hole of the chest of a viscount's son, whose wound had been covered with a metal plate. Harvey was not able to observe capillaries and could not account for the transfer of blood from arteries to veins.
How did George Santayana spend his last years?
The outbreak of World War II, Santayana found himself in Rome. He was unable to access his U.S. bank accounts and so took very modest accommodations in the Clinica della Piccola Compagnia di Maria, Clinic of the Little Company of Mary. This clinic was run by an order that, because of the color of their habits, were known as the Blue Nuns. Santayana ended up spending 13 years there, until he died. Originally, he stayed on because he liked the safety of the convent as a refuge from the war. But in time he came to appreciate its old-fashioned ways away from the hustle and bustle of modern life, for their own sake.
Why was Aquinas called the angelic doctor by Catholics?
Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, was called the angelic doctor because he believed there were beings with intellectual powers and abilities greater than those of humans. They existed on the highest level of the universe and were purely spiritual. Although finite, they were angels.
Does philosophy only deal with the big questions about life and the universe?
Not all philosophical work is about important questions. Some of it may seem absurd to non-philosophers.
What was F. H. Bradley like as a person?
Bradley was made a Fellow at Merton College, Oxford, in 1870. This was a lifetime position with no teaching duties, which only marriage could terminate. Bradley never married, and he lived on campus until he died. A kidney inflammation in 1871 left him careful of his health. And although he participated in the governance of the college, he avoided other social occasions. For instance, he turned down an opportunity to be a founder of the British Academy. Bradley detested cats and shot them on the college grounds, during the night. R.G. Collingwood. His neighbor for 16 years, later wrote, "Although I lived within a few hundred yards of him, I never to my knowledge set eyes on him."
What was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's lasting influence?
Although his thought, along with that of other 19th-century anarchists, was neglected after World War I. Some of Proudhon's social ideas remain influential in contemporary economic organization. Examples of this include the representation in management of workers in large industries, as well as cooperative housing units and food growing and buying projects.
What are some of the current issues in Native American philosophy?
The concerns address politics, ecology, religion, and feminism. The Native American claims are both straightforward and difficult to solve. Political activist and former ethnic studies professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, Ward Churchill, has argued that progressive movements within mainstream American society do not address Native American ideals because those progressive movements are dedicated to getting more of the prizes of technology and capitalism. Traditional Native Americans, by contrast, seek to withdraw from the dominant system and into self-sufficient traditional communities. To some extent, the current political issues of Native Americans concern ecology and environmentalism. On the one hand, Native Americans may refuse to be used as symbols of ecological virtue, even though ideals of self-sufficiency on tribal lands do rely on sustainable ecological practices. It is a significant irony that some Native American communities have been able to use profits from their casinos to purchase those ancestral lands that the U.S. promised them in unfulfilled treaties. Viola Cordova, 1937–2002, a university professor and the first Native American to earn a doctorate in philosophy. She was also part Hispanic, argued that the history of Western philosophy has an overwhelming Christian bias and influence in ways that are incomprehensible to thinkers in native cultures. Ann Waters, another Native American philosopher, as well as an attorney who teaches at California State University at Bakersfield, has challenged the myth of European discovery of the Americas, referring to oral traditions claiming that Native Americans have always inhabited the Americas. Native American women writers such as Paula Gunn Allen have traced matriarchal patterns in indigenous political history, which were dislodged by European settlers who refused to negotiate with female leaders. This suggests very different feminist concerns among Native American women compared to Western feminists. Recovering political power instead of attaining it.
What was Peter Kropotkin's doctrine of anarchist communism?
Kropotkin's proposals proceeded from the needs of consumers. He envisioned a free distribution warehouse. Instead of the collectivist production cooperatives proposed by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, 1809–1865. The main cohesive forces were to be based on social ties, rather than production goals. In his La Conquête du pain, The Conquest of Bread, Kropotkin attempted to work out the details of his system, which was based on ideas previously developed in Thomas More's 1516 work, Utopia, and directly made known to Kropotkin by François Dumartheray, who had worked with Kropotkin in setting up the journal Le Revolte.
Who was William James?
William James, 1842–1910, built on Charles Peirce's, 1839–1914. Pragmaticist ideas to create a more humanistic form of pragmatism. James was also the founder of modern psychology as a science independent of subjective introspection. His principal works include The Principles of Psychology, 1890, The Will to Believe, and other essays in popular philosophy. 1897, The Varieties of Religious Experience, 1901–1902, and Pragmatism, 1907.
What is known about Aristotle's life?
Aristotle of Stagira, 384–322 b. CE, also known as the Stagirite, was the son of Nicomachus, who was the Macedonian king Amyntas II's court physician. Aristotle's career was shaped by this relationship with his scientific father. When Aristotle was 17, he enrolled in Plato's academy in Athens. After Plato died in 347 BCE, and the academy's curriculum changed toward the mathematical and speculative interests of its new head. Speusippus, 407–339 BCE, Aristotle left for Assos, which was then under the leadership of Hermias, a former slave who rose to the position of ruler that his master had held. Aristotle married Hermias' niece, Pythias, in 345 BCE, and after Hermias died, he traveled to Lesbos. The island of Lesbos, in the northeastern Aegean Sea, had a great diversity of marine creatures and contemporary mammals, as well as many ancient fossils. Aristotle pursued his biological research on the taxonomy of living beings there. In 343 BCE, King Philip of Macedonia invited Aristotle to serve as tutor to his son, Alexander, who was to become Alexander the Great. In 335 BCE, Aristotle returned to Athens. He founded a school, the Lyceum, in a grove dedicated to Apollo Lycurgus outside of the city. At the Lyceum, Aristotle lectured and directed research. He also constructed and stocked the first great library in ancient times. The walkway under a colonnade, or peripatos, was the source of the name Peripatetics that was given to the members of the Lyceum. After the death of his wife, Pythias, Aristotle lived with and had a son with her, Philus. Their son was named after Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, after whom he also named his work on ethics. When Alexander, now Alexander the Great, died in 325 BCE, Aristotle retired to Chalcis, where he lived for the remainder of his life.
Why did Martin Heidegger claim that existentialism was not a type of humanism?
In going back to pre-Socratic thought, Heidegger concluded that the original concern of man, or Dasein, in a cultural line that linked contemporary Germans to ancient Greeks, was being. Heidegger believed that the pre-Socratics had only started to formulate the primary questions concerning being when the Socratics introduced a subject-object kind of metaphysics that already foreclosed one kind of answer to the original question of being. Heidegger makes it clear to the reader that he does not know what this original question concerning being was. Indeed, he devoted his philosophical work to trying to reconstruct the question, thereby inviting readers to ponder the same problem he did, with no conclusive answer. In this sense, Heidegger provides an exercise in meditation. To those of his readers who take the time to understand him, Heidegger wrote much about what that question might be. Relying on a phenomenological intuition that language is the house of being. He did not mean by this the language of the they, or even the discourse of French existentialists, such as Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980, with its insufficiently general concerns. Until the question of being could be formulated, the kind of humanism that existentialism could not even be properly imagined, according to Heidegger.
Who was Ludwig Wittgenstein?
Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889 to 1951, had two distinct philosophical periods. First, was his ambitious development of logical atomism that was influenced by his teacher Bertrand Russell. 1872 to 1970, resulting in his writing Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921. Second was Wittgenstein's original, ordinary language theory of philosophy. This was an original insight about ordinary language. Wittgenstein was unquestionably a genius.
Was Montaigne the only skeptical philosopher to reason in this Pyrrhonic way?
No. Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, derived his views from Sextus Empiricus, 160 to 210 CE. who held that we could not even know whether we had knowledge in certain cases. By 1590, Sextus Empiricus, 150–210, Hypotheses had been published in Latin, Greek, and English. Pyrrhonic skepticism died out by the 3rd century CE. Desiderius Erasmus, 1466–1536, was a closer predecessor to Montaigne, who defended Catholicism based on faith in de libero arbitro. 1524, on the grounds that theological controversies were inconclusive. Martin Luther, 1483–1546, responded to Erasmus with a dogmatic claim about his subjective certainty about God, based on his own conscience, as well as Scripture.
What is Sufism?
Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. Its classical period, or Golden Age, was from 1000 to 1500. Sufism is believed to have branched out from Baghdad to spread through Persia, India, North Africa, and Spain. The movement supported lodges and hospices for students, Sufi adepts, and others visiting on retreat. Sufi practitioners were expected to go through different levels of spirituality. First were the stations, requiring acts of will and actions to suppress individual egos and attachment to and desire for worldly things. This would lead to God's grace. Once God's grace was granted, it could be experienced individually as love, mystical knowledge, or the loss of ego consciousness. Sufism began as a marginal practice but was accepted by Islamic leaders in the 11th century. Mainly through Al-Ghazali's, 1058–1111, efforts. Sufism then developed along distinct practical and intellectual directions. The practical paths required training in religious formulas and initiation into orders. It was accompanied by many fraternal and social organizations that continue in the present Islamic world. The intellectual path developed philosophical terminology and absorbed Neoplatonic influences, culminating in Ibn Arabi's, d. 1240, system of theosophy. Within that system, God was held to be the only being. Everything else in existence was the result of his self-manifestation. The individual who could identify with all of God's self-manifestations would have the goal of becoming the perfect man, thus far attained only by the Prophet Muhammad. It is perhaps ironic that this intellectual path of Sufism developed when Al-Ghazali had embraced Sufism as part of a belief that knowledge and reasoning was not a reliable way to experience God.